Is there a preferred? I'll sit on this side. Hi, I'm Rosten. Oh. What a rookie move.
All right, there you go.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rosten. Before we get started with anything, I'm going to ask you to do something mildly annoying. If you don't feel like participating, just don't. It's okay. But I'm going to ask you to resort yourselves according to a couple dimensions. So first, if I could have everyone stand back up, and if you can, grab all your things. All right. So if you consider yourself an introvert, I'd like you to move to the back part of this seating area. If you consider yourself an extrovert, move forward. Bye, guys. But don't sit down, even once you've kind of sorted yourself partially. If you consider yourself someone who is a thinker, move to this side. If you consider yourself a doer, move to that side.
There's a little selection bias in this crowd, I think.
And then you can sit down. Wow, that was way more illuminating than I even thought it was going to be. So what does that mean? We have a lot of introverted I guess this is pretty predictable. We've got like a strong introvert thinker bias in this room. So hopefully you learned a little bit about yourself. You learned a little bit about other people in this room as individuals, and you also learned a little bit about the dynamics of this space and this gathering. All of that through a two-question questionnaire. So, of course, questionnaires are the subject of this book, which was wonderful. I encourage you all to buy it, read it, have it signed by Evan Kindley. He's going to read a short section of it to give you a sense of what he's writing about, and then we're going to ask some questions. All right, let's begin.
Okay. Thanks, Rosten. So I'm just going to read a little tiny bit of the introduction and then about half of Chapter 1, which chapters are pretty short. This is kind of the prehistory into the early history of the kind of questionnaires I'm talking about. Sort of one of the problems or one of the challenges with a book like this is to kind of figure out where to start, when exactly the kind of object you're talking about comes into existence. With something like questionnaires, it really was hard because there are surveys of various kinds that go back really millennia. But I was sort of particularly interested in a kind of, I guess you call it personal questionnaire, or a questionnaire that sort of had to do with human beings and their characteristics, right? It's not about surveys of how many oxen you have or something like that. It's like, it's more about your personal, what we now call personal data, right? So I wanted to I'll just read a little bit here about how this particular kind of questionnaire comes into being. Most pre-modern questionnaires, like the Cedula issued in 1577 by King Philip II of Spain to account for royal holdings in the Indies, were instruments of governance geared toward enumerating and keeping track of state property. They were not beloved. The word questionnaire appears first in French, in its modern sense, in the mid-19th century. Some of the word's early uses suggest persistent associations with the Catholic practices of catechism and confession, as well as with governmental inquisition and interrogation. In the 18th century, the term questionnaire juré described a torturer. Questionnaires weren't instruments of torture exactly, but they were vehicles of the scarcely more popular process of taxation. Respondents were asked about things that could easily be identified, described, and counted, and in which the state might take an interest, primarily money and property. It was not always easy to get people to respond. Hostility toward taxation seems to have bled into people's reactions to other kinds of surveys as well. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, naturalists inspired by Sir Francis Bacon experimented with questionnaires as a means for soliciting reports about the flora and fauna of distant regions to which it would be impracticable to travel. For From 1645 on, a group of intelligencers associated with the agricultural reformer Samuel Hartlib issued a series of surveys to landed gentry and parish priests about the features of their respective home regions. The first entry of Thomas Matchell's snappily titled, this is all the title, that the northern counties which abound in antiquities and ancient gentry may no longer be buried in silence, information is desired concerning the following queries as they lie in order. That's the end of the title. For instance, reads 1. The name of the parish and why so called, how written in ancient records, in what diocese, barony, hundred, or ward is it said to lie, how is it bounded and divided from other parishes on the east, west, north, and south, etc., by what rivers, hedges, walls, causeways, or common and well-known landmarks, meets and boundaries, etc., or are they, or any of them, litigious or doubtful? All of these early scientific questionnaires had return rates approaching 0. When they came back at all, the respondents often expressed skepticism toward the entire enterprise. One landowner wrote that he did not care to be concerned over much in any business that has not at least some appearance either of present pleasure or future profit. What is surprising, perhaps, is not that the returns to such inquiries were so poor, the historian Adam Fox observes, but that researchers continued to be optimistic about their value for so long. Fox is right. It's remarkable that in the face of overwhelming indifference, scholars persevered in crafting elaborate prompts and instructions for no one, sending out inquiry after inquiry into the abyss. Faith in the potential value of the questionnaire was strong enough to overcome its present uselessness. Throughout the 18th and even into the 19th century, the questionnaire was less a viable research technique than a utopian literary genre linked to an idea of the scientific perfection of society. A better world could be realized, reformers dreamed, or at least some progress toward it could be made if we could simply get people to fill out the necessary forms. And then I'll just read a little bit about a man named Francis Galton, who some of you may have heard of, who was sort of one of the early pioneers of the kind of questionnaires, psychological questionnaires that I'm interested in. In 1870, an English scientist named Francis Galton submitted a 7-page questionnaire to 180 members of the Royal Society of London for improving natural knowledge. Though hardly lacking in ambition, Galton was not at all confident of his success. It was a daring undertaking to ask, as I did in 1874, every fellow of the Royal Society who had filled some important post to answer a multitude of questions needful for my purpose, a few of which touched on religion and other delicate matters, he recalled in his 1908 autobiography. The size of my circular was alarming. Much experience of sending circular questions has convinced me of the impossibility of foretelling whether a particular person will receive them kindly or not. Some are unexpectedly touchy. One man of high scientific distinction, Galton remembered, was almost furious at being questioned. On the other hand, a cabinet minister, whom I knew but slightly, gave me full and very interesting information without demur. Galton's nervousness about his daring undertaking is not surprising. Many of his queries, even by today's standards, are invasive. They touch on ancestry. Your father and mother, are they respectively English, Welsh, Scotch, Irish, Jewish, or foreign? Physical characteristics. Temperament, if distinctly nervous, sanguine, bilious, or lymphatic. Measurement, round inside rim of your hat. Education. How long were you at small schools, large schools, universities, and what ages? And matters of belief. Has the religion taught in your youth had any deterrent effect on the freedom of your researches? Galton felt the need to reassure the respondents that the responses would be kept anonymous. Entries marked private will be dealt with in strict confidence, he assured the questionnaires recipients. They will be used only as data for general statistical conclusions. Galton's survey was ultimately answered by about 100 scientists, including Charles Darwin and James Clerk Maxwell, and the results were eventually published anonymously and analyzed in his 1874 volume, English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. But Galton didn't stop there. The immediate aim of the book was to refute the arguments of the Swiss botanist Augustin Pyramus de Candolle, who held that environment and not genetic predisposition was the determining factor in scientific achievement. But Galton didn't stop there. From his data, he drew a raft of dubious generalizations. He concluded, for instance, that the character of scientific men is strongly anti-feminine. Their mind is directed to facts and abstract theories and not to persons or human interests. In many respects, they have little sympathy with female ways of thought. He also found that men of science were hostile toward classical education and religion, all opinions that dovetailed, as it happened, with Galton's own. Whatever the merits of his scientific conclusions, which even at the time were met with skepticism, Galton's study was a definite methodological success. More than any other single scientific work, English men of science established the self-report questionnaire in the United Kingdom as a legitimate instrument for the collection of empirical data. After these preliminary successes, much of Galton's energy would go toward convincing his contemporaries to respond to more and more questionnaires. Historically, this had been a Herculean task, as the Hartlib Circle's poor response rates attest. Galton, an ardent social reformer as well as a scientist, shared his predecessor's ambition and idealism. He, too, imagined a world remade by asking the right questions. But the specific details of his utopianism now seem more than a little disturbing. Like many of his contemporaries, Galton held deeply racist beliefs, which in his case had been reinforced by visits to Africa and the Middle East in the 1840s and 1850s. The superiority of white Europeans to all other races was for him an article of faith. Both his books Hereditary Genius and English Men of Science laid the foundation for eugenics, a science Galton both named and pioneered. In a paper published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1904, he defined eugenics as the science that deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage. In simultaneously fostering the sciences of anthropometrics, statistics, actually, I'm going to skip this part. The eugenics movement would go on to have a catastrophic influence in the first half of the 20th century, most notably in Nazi Germany, and there is no question that Galton, though he died in 1911 before eugenics' worst excesses would become evident, deserves a share of the shame. For the moment, however, I am less concerned with what Galton is trying to prove, with what Galton is trying to prove, the genetic superiority of white European aristocrats to all other human beings on the planet, than with how he went about proving it. In his work on heredity, he took the first steps towards solving a major practical problem for the social sciences: how to convince people to overcome their disinclination to provide personal information about themselves. Most men and women shrink from having their hereditary worth recorded, Galton observed in the Fortnightly Review in 1883. There may be family diseases of which they hardly dare to speak, except on rare occasions and then in whispered hints or obscure phrases, as though timidity of utterance could hush thoughts, and as though what they fondly suppose to be locked-up domestic secrets may not be brooded about with exaggeration among the surrounding gossips. This reluctance to share accurate details of family medical history seemed to Galton ignoble, and yet, moralize as we may, the difficulty remains. The solution, he decided, was to target medical men specifically, who he believed would be tempted by an appeal to their scientific zeal to write about themselves at their best and in great multitudes. At the same time, he exploited financial instincts, offering cash prizes of up to £500 to those candidates who shall best succeed in defining vividly, completely, and concrete and concisely the characteristics, medical and other, of the various members of their respective families. Finally, he appealed to Victorian domestic sentiment, claiming that the completion of his questionnaires would bring families closer together. The inquiries I wish to set in motion by means of these prizes are undertakings in which many relatives will gladly join, he predicted. It involves much pleasant correspondence with early friends who had long dropped out of sight, and it creates an agreeable bond of interest with the relations living at a distance. His emphasis was on the generation of family heirlooms rather than experimental data. Whatever may be the value of these results, the facts incidentally obtained during the course of the inquiry will form a separate document much prized by the family, Galton declared, and he collaborated with the publishing industry to produce such documents. In 1884, Macmillan brought out Record of Family Faculties and supplemented it with a pamphlet entitled The Life History Album, in which new or expectant parents could record the development of their offspring as they grew. With this stratagem, Galton invented the baby book, a popular genre that continues to flourish today. So I'll leave it there.
So your book kind of traces a trajectory of this survey instrument from something that people kind of really disliked doing to kind of something that people now do kind of for their own edification, for pleasure, and kind of can't stop doing. And kind of the joy that people have in answering questions. So can you maybe, in a capsule way, kind of talk about how that trajectory came to be? Like, why is it that people now kind of like love to take questionnaires on the internet, love to take Myers-Briggs tests, all these kinds of things that at one point would be like very painful? Like, what's the difference between a Galton or pre-Galton survey and what we have now?
Yeah, so that was kind of insofar as I had a question guiding guiding my research and guiding my reading. That was it. It was kind of, at what point did questionnaires become fun? Sort of stipulating they are fun. Not everybody thinks they're fun. In fact, one of my editors was like, "Oh God, I hate questionnaires so much," when I started doing this, and it kind of made me paranoid because I'm like, well, maybe everybody does. But I think it is really true that a certain kind of questionnaire, a certain kind of personality quiz, the sort of starting point for me, although it's the end of the book, was really the BuzzFeed's quizzes that were they're still pretty common, but they were kind of ubiquitous at the beginning of 2014, right? And so, what city should you really live in? What kind of Care Bear are you? Whatever, just all kinds of different personality tests. And it seemed that people really were addicted to them. I took a lot of them, in part because I was starting to think about this book, but also just because they're fun. So I was interested in whether any kind of line, sort of significant line, could be drawn, because I knew just a little bit about the early history of social science and self-report questionnaires and stuff. Just trying to figure out how to get from here to there, whether they're really, whether it was a case of one form kind of evolving into another, or whether they were kind of on parallel tracks. And what I found was there sort of are parallel tracks in that from the very beginning there were questionnaires for fun. The section that just follows the one I read is about Victorian confession albums, which are with this popular fad in the 1870s where people would fill out questionnaires. The most famous is the Proust Questionnaire, which is still kind of reprinted in Vanity Fair and other places today. But, as early, at the time Galton was working, essentially there were people who were taking kinds of personality questionnaires for fun. And what I was finding was that the sort of history of social science and various attempts to kind of extract information on a large scale were running parallel to this other history of questionnaires and quizzes as games, as amusements, but they keep kind of interweaving in interesting ways. And then other things like eugenics, which I didn't expect to be writing about at all, weirdly just kept... It's not just Galton, it just kept popping up everywhere. So a lot of what I thought of as slightly kind of sinister things were kind of cropping up too.
So to just dive right into that, like, is there a downside or a dark side to a BuzzFeed questionnaire? Like, is that something that you're worried about? Is there like a eugenic component of that activity?
I mean, no. I wouldn't. I did look into that question a lot. I mean, so insofar as anybody worries about BuzzFeed quizzes, which is not that much, because essentially they are just silly and fun, right? At the worst, a waste of time, but not not evil. There is a certain concern out there that isn't original with me about them, which is that BuzzFeed may be somehow retaining the information that people give to them, repackaging and selling that information. Basically, at this point, there is a pretty lucrative market for personal data extracted in any number of ways, and very few legal restrictions or regulations on it. So it's certainly not impossible that BuzzFeed is harvesting the data, because they are getting many millions of people to enter in trivial but personal data in bulk. So the question is what gets done with that data and whether it might be used for purposes that the people who took the quizzes didn't sign up for. Because it isn't like in the social sciences there's what is it called, the thing where you have to
like a human
IRBs, yeah. You need to what is it?
It's release
A release, yeah. So,
you are aware that you're being studied.
yes, exactly, right. That kind of comes out of like Stanley Milgram and all these abuses of power in psychology and sociology. So, and that doesn't exist, obviously, when you take a BuzzFeed quiz. You're not signing a release saying, I understand this is being used for experimental research, or I understand this is going to be sold to a third party. You're just plugging in information.
Right. So if your kind of initial entry point to this research was sort of your own use of quizzes for personal edification, like having gone through this kind of long history, do you feel like you have a really substantially different perspective on like what, why you even are taking these quizzes, or like what's driving the popularity of them?
I mean, I still think they're fun, and I think that they're, I think that, and I don't think the question of why they're popular is simple. I mean, I think that you see a fair amount of dismissive stuff about BuzzFeed quizzes or internet quizzes or Myers-Briggs or any of this, that essentially it's just about narcissism. It's just about people wanting to think about themselves and wanting to, basically, to think about themselves. And I think that's a part of it. Certainly, but there's a social element. I mean, one of the ways that the BuzzFeed quizzes are so similar to the Victorian confession albums is those were also shared among groups of friends, right? And part of the fun of it was seeing what your friends answered to questions and so social media has really kind of, I think, brought that element of the questionnaire back. And then I think there's also a part in terms of why these things are so popular, especially something like Myers-Briggs. We really have a faith in science, which is almost kind of touching because none of these things work. I mean, not even the really hardcore scientific ones that psychologists have tried to make. None of them have very good track records as far as actually predicting anything about people's behavior or their personalities. I mean, they're all essentially frivolous in a sense. So, but I think that even people who take the BuzzFeed quizzes or the Myers-Briggs tests online, there's some part of them that's like believes in the method, believes that they can actually get a real result by putting this information in.
I have many more questions. Maybe I'll just limit myself to just a couple and then open it up to you all to kind of finish the ritual of questioning post reading. But I guess, let's go with this one. So what is the trait that you most despise in yourself?
I knew that one. I didn't know which Proust questionnaire question was coming. I knew one was. The trait that I most despise in myself. Let's say cowardice.
And your most treasured possession?
My daughter? Is that a possession? No, it's not really a possession.
It is to you.
Yeah. I'm like her legal guardian. So. Let's go with that.
All right. And how would you like to die?
In my sleep.
All right. And then what is your annual income? But the reason I asked that last one is some questions are obviously more fun to answer than others.
Yeah.
And you sort of see that there's sort of like there's different levels at which people, there's a gradient, I guess, of like personal disclosure that doesn't necessarily overlap completely with like this kind of personal vulnerability maybe.
Right.
Do you feel like you've discovered like sort of like where the dividing line is, or where do people stop wanting to answer questions?
For me personally, or for like humankind?
For like in terms of like how these surveys are designed, it seems like one of the threads in the book is that the most successful surveys kind of end up being either like institutionally mandatory, or things that somehow people are just compelled to answer them, even though there's like literally no reason for them to do so. And in some ways, the ones that are like that become truly successful, like Myers-Briggs, it's like people start doing them, even though they might develop in a kind of social science realm, they become this other kind of thing. Whereas, no one fills out a census form for fun. That's not a fun activity for anybody.
Right. Yeah, and I think, like, for instance, my editor, when he said, I hate questionnaires, I think he was thinking of, like, tax forms, census forms, like doctor's office forms, like, he was thinking of, like, real bureaucratic. Because that's almost, and I think in the introduction I kind of distinguished, because, like, there really is like the form, right? The bureaucratic form, and the only point of that is to sort you and kind of fit you into a system, and really there's nothing in it for you except that you can access the service that it doesn't tell you anything about yourself that you didn't already know. And then there's questionnaires, which tend to like at least claim to give you some kind of knowledge or test you so that you can be on some kind of that you can be sort of another thing I talk about in the book is Scientology tests, Scientology personality tests, right? And the idea behind that is that you are identifying the flaws in your personality. I mean, they don't tell you they're looking for flaws. They say, you're just what kind of person are you? But it always is you're horribly flawed, person. And then they try to sell you classes that are appropriate to that. So yeah, I might be losing track of the question, but
well, let's maybe open it up. I'll like re-ask it as like an underlying thread that you can like pick up if you want. But it's just sort of like, what are the kinds of questions that people like to answer? Which I think you've kind of gotten at.
Right. I think anything that seems trivial, that seems like no one would actually benefit from having that information about you, which is part of why the BuzzFeed things are so successful, I think, is that they're ridiculous. Like the things they're testing for are ridiculous, the questions are ridiculous, the whole thing is, like it's usually, it's all kind of designed to seem very unserious. Right, but I mean, the funny thing about that is that in some cases you are giving up information that is, in another context, you might never give up. Right, there was one that was very popular, sort of viral hit. How privileged are you? I think, which was like the form of a checklist, and you check off various things, and some of them are like, have you ever been in a mental hospital? Like, have you, things like that. Do you have do you have an STD? All these things that, I'm not sure that was actually a question, but very personal information, right? That was supposed to assess, are you a privileged person or not? And if that information were put into a different context, it could be used to discriminate against you in all kinds of ways. So anyway, that's my answer. I think people are usually fine answering questions as long as they don't really think about what use they'll be put to. Mm-hmm. And in fact, some of the older questionnaires I looked at they're just kind of hilariously blunt about ways to test for psychosis or something. I'm trying to remember exact examples, but they're just so on the nose, right? About do you know anybody who was trying to do you harm? Do you ever have a queer feeling as if you were not your old self? Do you feel like jumping off when you were on a high place? Do you feel a strong desire to go and set fire to something? It's like these things are how can anyone not realize they're being tested for psychosis? Anyway.
All right, so with that, we invite you to test Evan for psychosis. If you have any questions, this is sort of maybe a rare opportunity to learn from an expert. Anything you've ever wondered about questions, or maybe to find out about Evan himself?
I know everything about questions.
He's compelled to answer everything. I guess I'll call on people. You in the black shirt who's not Lyra.
Not quite sure how someone interpreting form would see that. And I'm really interested in psychological realism. So there are certain perspectives, like if you're on a dock watching a cruise ship, there's almost a feeling you can lean down and touch it, or there's some very subtle psychological, normal, bizarre, group, tribal kind of feelings, aspirational. You can almost go there, real borderline or something. I'm very interested in that territory. So I just throw that at you.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I guess, psychology is a big part of I think psychology and sociology are the two kind of disciplines that I look at the most. And Galton is sort of, one of the founding, he's very important in the history of psychology as well. He had a questionnaire that I skipped over called the Breakfast Table Questionnaire, which is about visual imagery, and it asks you to imagine your breakfast table and describe what's there. It's sort of a test of visual imaging. So I don't know what you were saying about sort of being able to visualize something in your mind. And I think one of the problems that has cropped up in the history of psychology, and it's just a problem that's kind of intrinsic to psychology, is tests have to assume some kind of normal, right? They have to assume some kind of baseline mental health, and it's certainly not obvious what that is, right? It's certainly not obvious. Yeah, possibly. So you can improve the test however much you want statistically, and you can refine these instruments more and more, but you're still working with an essentially subjective idea of mental health to begin with. So I think that's a problem that's never really gotten solved. Maybe some psychologists would disagree with me, but I don't think many would actually. There's essential kind of arbitrariness to it, and yet because questionnaires are these kind of technical instruments, people can just kind of focus on, let's improve the technology, let's improve the test, and you're not addressing the original problem, which is what are you testing for? What are you trying to discern?
All right, more questions. You.
What's your annual salary? any meaningful difference between questionnaires administered by an actual human being to another person and questionnaires that a person might just take on their own? It'd be like the quality of the information captured, people's degree of honesty, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, there are differences. I'm trying to think. I think I read a fair amount about this that didn't end up in the book, but I still will try to answer. So the question is just about differences between questionnaires that are administered by people versus ones that are administered by, taken over the internet or administered by a machine, or maybe even going further back, like write-in ballots and things. So it can go either way. I mean, it's sort of I think it's well known in like polling that people will sometimes lie to a human being. Well, some of them won't be honest about their real opinions. And I know this was recently came into play with polls about Trump, right? Is that people were maybe underreporting support for Trump because they felt a little embarrassed to admit to a pollster that they were supporting Trump. So certainly, in some ways, human interaction can kind of skew the results, and you might get better, more accurate results from people taking a survey on the internet or via mail. On the other hand, I think having a human being there probably gives you some sense of like responsibility to the survey, whereas you might, in the privacy of your own home, be more. I mean, I know with something as trivial as like the BuzzFeed things, people don't care about whether their answers are truthful, right? I mean, they're kind of, and they might take the test over and over and over to get a different result. So I don't think there's a necessarily. I wouldn't say that you get better results with a person as opposed to some other way. It kind of depends what the question is. But there is all kinds of interesting. I mean, especially in like mid-century, there was all kinds of research about how to elicit the best answers from people. I think that one of the things that was thought was that women were better at administering questionnaires than men, that people felt more comfortable with them, and et cetera. So yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I think it is still something that like psychologists and sociologists think about a lot.
All right, let's maybe take two more questions. You and then you. You.
Following on that about women, it made me think a lot about teenage girls doing lots of questionnaires in the magazine.
Yeah.
What else did you discover about gender?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on women's magazine quizzes. So that was fascinating to me, the kind of prehistory of that. It was yet another place where eugenics came into the picture, because the Cosmo quizzes and the quizzes in women's magazines, pretty much the ancestor of those, or the predecessor of those, is marriage counseling questionnaires, which sort of came about in America, and I think like the 20s and 30s, maybe a little bit later. And this guy named Paul Popenoe, who actually was right here in LA, was sort of one of the founding fathers of that discourse, that science of marriage counseling. Also a really hardcore eugenicist, did a lot of research about, he wrote a book called Sterilization for Human Betterment. Just like really, really hardcore. And one of the things, there was kind of a turn, actually. Okay, I can date it more precisely now. Yeah, there was a turn like after World War II. The Nazis kind of discredited eugenics, right? People, it was not cool anymore, and it was quite mainstream prior to that. Like it was pretty mainstream science. There were a lot of scientists who were arguing against it, but it had a lot of mainstream support, especially in psychology. So after the Nazis discredited eugenics, eugenicists didn't change their beliefs. They still thought we need to preserve the purity of the human race, which usually meant the white race, and we need to sort of select for the better traits or whatever. But there was a move from they call it negative to positive eugenics, so that instead of talking about sterilization and the unfit and things like this, they were talking about how to have a better marriage, how to find your perfect mate, et cetera, et cetera. That started to become a discourse of kind of more of positivity, right? And this filtered into women's magazines like pretty quickly. So there were all of the early quizzes in women's magazines were written first by male doctors, people like Popenoe. He had a famous column called "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" But a lot of male psychologists and marriage counselors were writing these quizzes. So this discourse, and of course, I don't mean to say also that because it has roots in this, it's an evil thing, and it's terrible that people take quizzes in women's magazines now, right? I mean, things all the time emerge out of kind of sinister origins and are fine. But yeah, so I was really interested in that particular discourse, and I think in a lot of ways. Sites like BuzzFeed borrow from women's magazines in terms of some of their rhetoric and some of their strategies for getting people to take their tests. So it's a very important kind of stream of things. This question of women and gender and marriage.
All right, last question. You.
Recently, I've been asked to fill out questionnaires by several grad students in various Facebook groups I'm in, where it's like I don't know them, but they're for their thesis or something, and having not been in grad school, wondering if that's like a major part of all research.
It's for their research. It's for
yeah.
Are they anthropologists or something or?
No.
Yeah.
So, maybe sociologists or something, but some of them also were, I thought, very poorly constructed, and I thought, if they had phrased this question differently, I could have gotten so much more info. I was also wondering, is that if you're studying anthropology or sociology, are there courses dedicated just to designing questionnaires?
I think so, yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot of books about it. I'd have to imagine there are courses on it, or at least methods courses, where they devote a lot of time to it. And this might be one of the drier parts of the book, although I found it interesting. But I did talk a little bit about questionnaire construction and all of the, for both political polls and marketing research surveys, which were sort of the two biggest. Those were where all the juice was with questionnaires in the mid-century, right? Figuring out who people are going to vote for and figuring out what they're going to buy. That was where all the money and all the research funding went. But yeah, people were very concerned about how to construct these questionnaires so that they would the questions would be the least ambiguous. So they would give you the most kind of pertinent answers, so that so they weren't biased in the case of polls. That they worked really hard to try to make these extremely rigorous instruments. And yeah, but it's true. A lot of the questionnaires you see, scientific ones, if they're made by grad students or even just scientists, can be really badly written, really confusing, totally unclear what they're asking, or depending on how you interpret the question, your answer might mean something completely different.
All right. Well, on that, we will save the remainder of our questions for one-on-one time. I guess one question we have is, where can we get a copy of this book?
Right here at Skylight Books.
Thank you so much. Evan will be signing.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.